Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Brandon Ho. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Oxeye, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this fireside conversation. Um, the topic of today's conversation will be shift left, which is a phrase that has permeated the application security space for quite a while now. Today we're going to explore the origins of the phrase, which, not surprisingly, did not start with application security and delve into some of the historical perspectives on the phrase, as well as how it's been applied into the secure software development lifecycle and then how it's evolved over time. We'll also take a look at modern day application development and software development paradigms to see how things have shifted in the time since the phrase was first coined in 2021. I'd like to welcome our guest. We're very honored and happy that he's here with us today, Chris Romeo. And I'm going to do a quick plug for him first before anything else. Chris will be presenting the AppSec State of the Union at RSA conference next week. So since everybody here has a strong interest in application security, and if you are planning on being an RSA, I strongly encourage you to check that out. Chris is a leading voice and thinker in application security, threat modeling, security champions. He's currently the CEO of Car Ventures and hosts the award-winning application security podcast as well as the Security Table podcast. He's been featured at numerous conferences and events such as RSA, AppSec Village at DEF CON, OWASP, Global AppSec, just many, many more. Chris founded Security Journey about 7 or 8 years ago, a security education company, which eventually led to an exit for him and his partner and wife, Deb, in 2022. Prior to that, Chris was the chief security advocate at Cisco and built out what's effectively a secure coding training program for something like 25,000 developers, if I recall correctly. He has 25 years of security experience, holding positions across the gamut, and is well regarded in the application security space. Dean Agron, who will be co-presenting or chatting with Chris in this conversation, is a cybersecurity expert with over 18 years of experience. He's known for his expertise in identifying market gaps and being able to clearly articulate complex and highly technical topics. And prior to co-founding Oxeye, Dean led the strategic consulting group at KHUT and has held executive leadership and engineering roles at Imperva and Checkpoint. Some quick housekeeping items. This video is being recorded, so if for some reason you need to drop off because you have a meeting or to have lunch, you can view it on our website. It will be available at www.oxeye.io starting tomorrow. This format is a fireside conversation. It's informal. Questions are very welcome. We've already received 1 or 2 offline. So please feel free to pop yours in the chat window. We are here to promote a conversation about a topic where many viewpoints and philosophies exist. So nothing here is sacred. And so I want you all to treat it as such. And welcome, Dean and Chris. I'm going to start us off by exploring the origins of the phrase shift left. Now, in my own personal research, I tracked its origins to a phrase that was called, to the origins of the phrase to an article written by Larry Smith in the Dr. Dobbs report back in 2001. But it originally referred to shifting quality assurance further left into the development process. Chris, I'd love to hear your perspective or your recollection of how that got absorbed into application security and how it's evolved since then.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, you're making me nostalgic. Dr. Dobbs Journal, come on. Like for those people that have been around like me for a number of decades, like that brings a little bit of a memory, of this magazine. But so yeah, I remember that the context of shift left in the quality assurance world, where I first saw it get applied to security. There is a gentleman who used to work at DHS, Department of Homeland Security here in the United States, right when Department of Homeland Security was being stood up. His name is Joe Jarzenbach, and he had created this website and kind of this movement called Build Security In. And so when I think about shift left, I think about shift left came from what Joe was doing at DHS and He put that site up in 2005. And so that's the first time I think we started thinking about security as being something that would exist across the life cycle, across the process or methodology we're using to build software. And then only over a period of time did we see Shift Left kind of come to life. And, when I first heard Shift Left, I mean, I'm thinking, man, this is probably 6-7 years ago, whenever it first came out. I thought it was a marketing term. Like I wrote it off as a marketing term. And it was only after having some conversations on my podcast with a guy named Jim Routh, who many people know in the industry, who's been a CISO at 5 different gigantic companies and has built more software security programs and AppSec programs than anybody else in our industry. He was the one that kind of pushed me and prodded me a little bit on this and said, hey, this Shift Left, it's not just a marketing thing. It's not just people trying to get attention. There really is some teeth to this, to using this as a fundamental way to influence the methodology. And so that's kind of the historic lesson, Brandon, that I take away from thinking about build security and becoming Shift Left.
I would say that it reminds me there's a very well-known book called The Phoenix Project, which describes the origins of DevOps. And it explains DevOps for how it started in factories, and then it puts it on software development. And I think that during my time with Imperva, when we just started shifting to AWS around 10 years ago, when it was actually my first RSA, which was 2013, we saw that it started to make sense that as part of the process of development and operations working together towards shorter feedback loops, and one line of progress with inner feedback loops, and one big feedback loop, like the three foundations of DevOps, then security had to be part of it. And I think saying Shift Left is the implementation of the shift from standard IT to DevOps on security. That's what comes up to mind when I try to locate the roots of Shift Left.
Yeah, and I think you just called on one of the classic books in our industry. Like if somebody hasn't read the Phoenix Project at this point, and the Phoenix Project came out when I was at Cisco, and I was working with different security teams around the globe. I bought a box of the Phoenix Project, and I literally carried it with me, and I had 3 or 4 with me in my bag at all times. And when I would meet somebody, I'd be like, "Oh, hey, you need to read this." Like that's the impact it had. And so, Dean, I love the fact that you're drawing that out, because that is something that really was a seminal work in watching, kind of Shift Left come to life, but also just it was really a industry changing book. Like 50 years from now, they'll look back and they'll say, what book really changed the security industry and the software development industry? It'll be the Phoenix Project.
Yeah.
Thanks for offering those perspectives, guys. So from the time that Shift Left started to really permeate the landscape of application security till today, and I tried looking for metrics that address this specifically, but found it difficult to find anything that was meaningful. What do you think the impact of this movement or paradigm shift has been for application security? And I mean, if you can provide some anecdotal evidence to one way or another, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, if one of the things that I always kind of chuckle to, and there's a lot of debate about this supposed IBM study that we all reference about the increased cost and expense of fixing a security defect in design versus when something gets to production. And it's almost become a mythical thing, and there's it gets referenced in all these other documents. And no matter whether it actually exists or not, I feel like it's common sense to say, if I fix a security issue during the design process, even in a DevOps world, I don't care what anybody tells me, you can't tell me there isn't design in DevOps. Like you can't tell me it's just pipelines. At some point, a developer takes a story off the stack. They don't just code it up. Like they have to stop and think, how is this going to work? You cannot, it's just common sense for me to say that if they find a security issue while they're in that little design, scribbling on a napkin, however they're building their feature before they start coding it, versus when that feature makes its way to production, it just has to be less expensive. Just because if it gets to production, the amount of rework I have to go through, I have to involve other teams. The worst part as a developer is 3 weeks later, I have to task switch. I have to take all of the things that I'm working on right now, set them off to the side. I have to reload my context of everything that went with that particular thing I was working on 3 weeks ago. And I have to then, fix whatever the bug was. And so for me, it's whether we agree that study is real or not, and whether those numbers are real or not. For me, it's just common sense that doing things earlier in the life cycle is going to be less expensive than waiting until we finish and we push to production.
Dean, anything you would like to share there?
So my take is there is the again I'm going to a bit to references. But there is the article by Fred Brooks, the No Silver Bullet about software engineering. And I think that when you say DevOps and then say security, then, let's shift left. Let's put it on developers. It's kind of the silver bullet tryout for modern software security. Because it makes sense for everyone. If developers own security, then because the amount of code and the pace of development is so fast, and there is no way that a gated team can actually block that, you must have developers must own that, because let's just give them this. Let's just give them that responsibility. And I think this is where vendor, and I'm taking responsibility. I was part of the vendors, and again. Today, I'm also a vendor. I think you cannot expect developers to do a major paradigm shift without providing them the right tools. And I think this is kind of the gap that is there, because everyone are expecting it from developers, but not really giving them the right tools. So I think
everybody's thinking of or using the term developer centric. I see this now used everywhere. I think there was one particular company that started using it, but it's become part of everybody's marketing approaches. Oh, we're developer centric, focused on the developer. And I'm somebody who believes the real way to security success is through the developer. We're never going to have enough security people. I have yet to find some organization somewhere that says, oh, we have a decent ratio of security people to developers. It's not going to happen. There's not enough revenue in the world to fund a 500 person security team if you have 5,000 developers. And even then we probably would still not have enough security people to cover all of the needs that we're trying to do. And so, for me, it comes down to whether it's the technology, however we're doing it, developer centric means we have to get the developers the knowledge, the tools, the experience, the resources to be successful, because the security team can't solve that problem. There's just not enough of us in the world to be able to solve it.
I'm going to shift tack slightly and focus on the actual software development paradigm. What has changed in the software development landscape since 2001, when this term first surfaced? And Chris, I'm going to direct this at you, and then I'd love to get your thoughts too, Dean. And I'd like for you to address things like architecture, the velocity, the number of languages supported, and just the overall expectations on developers as a whole, in light of the shifts and the transformations in how they've been developing software.
Yeah, all the way back to the year 2000. That's like we're going to need a time machine here. Doc Brown's going to need to get the DeLorean fired up for me here so we can go back and remember these moments and days. So much has changed. It's like the answer to your question, Brandon, is everything. Okay, next question. No, think about how we were building software in those days. We were using waterfall as our primary mechanism. Agile was just starting to be an idea that was kicked around from a methodology perspective. And so waterfall, we were in the days and years, I should say, of software releases where we went from a hard and fast requirements to design to coding and implementation to test to repeat the whole thing again and take 6 more months because we found an issue that required everybody to do all their stuff again. And so we went from this world of waterfall where everything was measured in years to this idea of agile where, hey, we're going to do things in sprints. We're going to move things faster. We're going to be able to see the workflow. And then we land on DevOps where we exist today, where things are moving at the speed of light. And the reason I say those two things, Agile and DevOps together, is because I think you need properties of both. Like, I don't think anybody does pure DevOps, because you have to have some mechanism to be able to schedule the work. You can't just have, I mean, yes, you can use Kanban. I understand Kanban being just a long list of things, and you pull something off. You pull whatever's the top priority off the stack as far as what you're going to work on. But what I found is that works only to a certain level. Like, you get to an engineering team that's like 10 or 15 people, and all of a sudden pulling the top thing off the list doesn't really scale as well as spending some time up front to do some planning. And so, yeah, I think about the way that everything has changed, and like, so much has changed. But the funny thing is, so much has not changed. Think about the OWASP top 10. How much has this changed since 2001? There's been a couple of new things, but a lot of the core things, we're still kicking the same software vulnerability and security issues down the road. We're continuing. Injection continues to be something that is a struggle for us as an industry. I used to joke that, we should just have an OWASP top 1. Like, why do we have 10? Why don't we just have the OWASP top 1? We fix that one. And once we fix that, then we can work on the rest of them. So yeah, I mean, to answer a long question, or long answer to a short question, everything has changed, but so many things have stayed the same. So many of the problems that we have, we still struggle with 20 years later, and we're really on a trajectory to still struggle with them 10 years from now, unfortunately.
Dean, I'm going to get your response, and then I'd like to address a comment that someone made in the chat section.
Sure. So I think it's first and foremost, it's the pace. It's the pace, the amount of code, the pace of development. And because the pace became much faster, and it's not just the pace, but also the demand, because 20 years ago, we did not have mobile phones. The internet was just starting. We did not have cloud. We did not have SaaS. We didn't have all of that. We had like physical appliances that you get a new version every 6 months. Today, you get your phone get updated every hour, and your apps. The amount of code that was created in the last you can combine, I think, the last 2 years are exactly like the last 20 years or similar comparison. And I think the increase in demand for business demands generated a much faster development pace, which demanded new abstractions or new abstraction layers. Because you cannot try, if you'll go and try to write a mobile app with C, you spend tons of time. And that's why you have today, higher languages like Python, like Node.js, which are much easier to use. So the pace is faster, but eventually it's software. So like Chris said, vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities. Computer science is computer science. Algorithms are algorithms. It's the same theory, but in practice, it just goes much faster. So, and this is where security struggle. And like you said, and Shift Left is one of the tryouts to take over that, to overcome these challenges. So again, that's kind of my view. Software is software. Algorithms are algorithms, and vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities. But there is just so many of them right now.
I just want to address a comment that Maninder made in the comment section. And she says, my own experience, this is a seismic shift for the digital era. And the entire ecosystem has to adapt together to make it successful. Keep documenting the lessons and best practices, because one size doesn't fit all and requires tailoring. Take baby steps to transition and adapt. Have a plan A and plan B. And I think both of you would probably agree with what Maninder said.
Yeah, it's tough to argue. Tough to argue with that. I mean, this is right on, right? We know the world is shifting. To Dean's point here just a second ago, with DevOps, you have some organizations that are pushing code 5,000 times a day. Like, there is no single pipeline. Like, these things are running in parallel. So this digital era is making things a lot more complicated. Yeah, I mean, it's about taking baby steps too. Like, that's another thing that I recommend. So, I mean, Maninder, great comment here. Like, this is the only way we move forward. You can't move. It's, you think about these big enterprises, right? It's like you're the captain of a ship, of a cruise ship. You don't turn that thing around and go the other way. You don't just flip the wheel and the thing goes, turns around. Like, you turn the wheel and it moves 1 degree at a time. And so what Meninder's talking about, those baby steps, are those 1 degree turns, which over time you can end up causing big change over 5 years if you move 1 degree per day.
I would say on that it's interesting if you put on the black hat versus the protector versus the attacker, and why is that, or versus the hacker? Because you have new abstraction layers, so you have that seismic shift, and today you have cloud native, for example. Okay, let's look into cloud native development when you have microservices, containers, clusters, a cloud environment. This seismic shift requires protectors to build new solutions. Like I said, they are built like, it's how do I build, I don't know, the cheese. Hackers needs to find the holes, and when you have such a seismic shift, it always comes with tons of holes because it cannot be bulletproof. So that's exactly what's going on right now. You have tons of abstraction layers, and each one of them brings its own risks. And the only but it also brings, like, you need methodologies, you need new languages, you have all these needs. Hackers still needs to find the same holes or similar holes, but hackers' tactics are quite the same, while defensive tactics must, re-architect everything. And I think that this is a major gap between hackers and offense and defense. And I think that's why the attack surface grew exponentially. And on the other hand, the security vendors also grew, but it's not in the same. They are always lacking behind the software development industry.
You're making me think of, you ever heard Richard Belichick has the defender's dilemma thing, the concept of the fact that we as defenders have to be right all the time. The attacker only has to be right once. And so, I think that summarizes what you're saying. And it's definitely, that's not my thought. That's Richard Belichick, who summarized that whole thing into one way of thinking about it. Because, cloud native, you think about containerization, orchestration, infrastructure as code. Like, we've got all these new things that are now playing in a cloud native world. And we know new things don't necessarily mean secure things. And so, to your point, like, we have to have, we have to be right all the time as defenders.
So Dean's already alluded to this, but it's clear that the changes in software development methodologies and paradigms have changed a lot of things when it comes to application security. Does this shift force us to rethink shift left for a more contemporary situation?
I would say, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that one of the things that we have to recognize when we in a shift left world is we got to go further than shift left. Like, left is great, but we also got to go to the right. We got to shift in all directions. And I used this as a joke in a talk I did at RSA a couple of years ago. The fact that, we're shifting left, we're shifting right, now we're shifting everywhere. We're actually talking about secure development lifecycle again. What we used to call this thing 15 years ago is now come full circle. We can call it whatever we want, but what it ultimately is a solid process that runs in conjunction with our software development process, not on top of it, not below it. It runs integrated into our software development process, where we're automating as much as we can of the security capabilities, and we are doing the things that we need to do to have a secure future. So, secure right, let's secure production instances with tools that are checking for vulnerabilities in containers and in runtime applications with RASP and stuff like that. Let's also do all the things to the left that we're talking about shifting left here. At the end of the day, we're securing the entire process.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm trying to find the right to articulate it right. I think that shift left as a phrase was like the first generation of how do we protect the mass of code that is being generated. It was a phrase or a claim that represented a process, but you cannot win with the process. You need to win with the process, with the people, and with the product. And for the people, you need to train them earlier than during the time that they build software. You must provide them accurate results. You must provide them clear remediation guidelines. They need to see security issues as standard issues. They don't care if it's a security issue or a performance issue. They need to resolve it, and they need to be trained on it and educated on it. So I think that's the part of the people. The process, right? They need to get the data during their inner circles, during the time that they're building the software. That's the optimistic. And then there are the products. And I will also separate here because you have. I'm divided. Not me again. There is the division of indication of exposure and indicators of a compromise. These are two separate landscapes. One is left, one is right. But today, because the pace is faster and you have DevOps, then the border is grayed out, which makes things much more confusing. I think what it requires is, I would say, it requires more of a security planning or security architecture in the strategic level of planning. How do you want to protect all that? And shifting left is a phrase, but like Chris said, you need to shift right. You need to gather data from your runtime environment, not just doing dev time, because then the scope is very limited. So again, on the one hand, your indication of exposure, indication of compromise. On the other hand, you need from where do you collect the data from where the security products collect the data, and where do they put it out to it's a matrix, because security products collect the data from production, from testing, from staging, from dev, and on the other hand, they provide they need to provide actionable items to developers and to SecOps, and so there's no shift left. It's everything all together. And like every, I would say, managed chaos, it requires planning. And I think that's the main thing that is now becoming the standard. Building a security program, building an AppSec program, not just acquiring WAF or acquiring application security testing, but building a program that integrates all of them.
So it's clear that to secure our applications properly, this requires a more comprehensive and broad-based approach to security, period. So I think maybe the old moniker shift left will eventually evolve into something else like shift anywhere or shift everywhere or whatever you want to call it. Or we could go back to the roots of this movement and just say secure software development lifecycle, as Chris mentioned a little earlier. So in light of that fact, if we study it that way, I mean, what would you consider the core tenets of a modern secure SDLC or shift everywhere approach, Chris?
I mean, I'm going to come back to something that Dean mentioned. I use the same framework to think about how we're putting together this kind of top-notch AppSec program. It's people, process, tools. For me, I'm adding governance. Governance is a piece of this as well. And so, when you think about the people side, I mean, you have to educate. Dean mentioned this already. You have to educate people. You can't expect your software developers are coming into your company from university with a deep understanding of software security and application security vulnerabilities and secure coding. They're just not getting it. So you're going to have to give it to them from the people perspective. The process is about putting together the secure development lifecycle, having the right pieces. And for me, that means, I'm starting early with Threat modeling is something that's happening for me very, very early in any program that I'm a part of. I mean, you have to have requirements. I disguise them as security best practices now because nobody likes requirements. So if you call it a security best practice and they look at, oh, it's a best practice, we need to apply it. Spoiler alert, it's actually a requirement in disguise. I just disguise that thing. So, security best practices, threat modeling, those developers have to be taught and they have to be able to implement this idea of threat modeling, looking at a design before they start writing hundreds of lines of code and saying, okay, do we have anything? Are there any known issues I can see with security that I could squash here? And then once you get to the actual implementation, I mean, I think there is still value in secure coding guidance, especially for bigger companies, not for startups, because startups, you don't have time to write a secure code guide. But like like Cisco, where I worked before, having a secure code guide is something that people can use as a reference. And then after that, you've got your layers of different tooling, let Dean mention from the application security testing side, all the different AST things that are out there from a tooling perspective. And, after that, you're pushing things into production. And so that kind of layers the process. I talked about the tools in that context, governance being the last thing. Once again, if you're a startup, you don't need governance. You can forget the G that I added on the end of this. But, when companies start becoming more mature, your AppSec program becomes more mature. And then it becomes about using governance to figure out and metric, how are we doing? Like how many of our user stories are being threat modeled? What percentage? How many times is SAST being used in the right spot in pipelines at the right time? What's the mean time to resolution on individual issues that are being found in the tooling? Like now we can start to metric. So it's almost like governance and metrics for me runs together into building a world-class application security program. And I guess the last caveat I would say is all of those things I just said, don't expect you're going to do that in month one. This is a multi-year path of things that you can do to have a world-class AppSec program. And for me, that's world-class. That means something. That means you're at the top of the industry, the best of the best. But to our comment earlier from Aninder, it's all about baby steps. So to get there.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit into something you just said, Chris, and then we have a question in the comment section, which I will address after that. But, we talk about part of the shift left movement, of course, is enabling developers with the tools and processes to write more secure code. Now, most people don't know this, but if we stretch the space-time continuum enough, you and I have both intersected at some point in the past because of our association with a common company in secure coding training. But I'm curious about, from a secure coding training perspective, do you think from a practical perspective, it makes sense for that kind of instruction to happen within a developer's IDE or within the AppSec testing tools that they are using, or does it need to be something that resides somewhere completely different?
Yeah, I mean, this is a philosophical issue for me in that I think and truly very strongly believe we need to protect the developer when they're in their IDE. So developers get into their IDE, developers, it's a studied fact. Developers have this thing called flow. And when you're coding, you're into the flow. You've got all the things. It's a very complicated job. So you've got all these moving pieces of data in your head. You're trying to process them. The worst thing that can happen is for your IDE to go, wah, boom, pop up a little red screen. What did I just do? I just distracted you from that. And so I like to think of security education as something that happens outside of the IDE, because I want developers to be able to focus on the security education. I want them to have a good enough solution that they're willing to focus on it because they see the value. But I think that that time that the developers in their IDE is so precious that I don't want to constantly be going, a little buzzer going off and I'm completely wrecking their flow. Because then what happens? What does the developer say? What do you think about the security training? It's terrible. It's because it's breaking them from being able to do what they're best at, which is focus and write awesome software. So that's a philosophical thing for me, and that could be a philosophical debate for the ages.
Yeah.
So I would
go ahead.
I'll add my comment first. As an ex-kernel developer, I think that eventually, I think all of us spend some time building software in the past, and I think that. In theory, I think Chris is right. In theory, you need to be in the zone. Nothing should interfere you. But I think in reality, you're part of a team, you're part of several processes, and the amount of time that you spend in the zone is very limited regardless of the security event. And I think that we need, or modern security solutions should try to make themselves as part of the process as much as possible. And I'll explain. Today, developers have not exceptions. Exception is a technical word. They get interfered by, let's say, QA teams that tests that had failed, and these tests are performance tests, functionality tests that fail, and require them to resolve them. And I think that security must be the same thing. And that's why there is the part of the training, because they must have the basic knowledge, like they know, a complexity, and they know that you have a first layer of complexity, second layer of complexity, and if you're in an exponential complexity, most likely your software would fail because it would take months to run. Then these security foundations must be taught earlier as part of the training. But on the other hand, the security alerts must be provided them similarly to functional issues or functional bugs, because it should be the same as if you have Jira ticket for a functional error, then you need to have a Jira ticket for a security error, but it must be explained in a reason that they can understand, we can understand as developers, because and I think this is a major gap, and this is it requires everyone to adjust. Software training or developers training on security, and security solutions to provide the remediation guidelines in a way that developers can actually understand them, not just saying them, yeah, you have a SQL injection and this is the line. Okay, I'll scratch my head. What does it mean? And I think that's something that is on us vendor, and I would say proudly that we are focusing on that with Oxeye, to bring the developers results that they can actually chew on. You can't throw at developers hundreds of vulnerabilities. They will look at it, look at it and go back, because they will say, I don't know what to do with that. But if it's actionable and if it's focused, then they can actually do something with it, and it will, I would say, move them towards acting or towards working to resolve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've completely forgotten that ChatGPT is going to take over and do all the coding for us in a very short time in the future. We won't have to worry about any of this because
we'll just have cocktails on a beach somewhere. I'm gonna go back a little bit in time and pick up a question that Angela asked in the comment section. What are organizations doing to close that gap in security acumen? Obviously, there's a shortage of security practitioners to support an army of devs. So is there a push toward education to remove friction? And I think you are uniquely situated to address this particular question, given the journey of your last 7+ years, Chris.
Yeah, I think there definitely is an opportunity for organizations to take a very front and center approach to security education by providing some type of a educational program for developers, like I said, that are joining the company and don't have any security knowledge. I think the other really powerful thing here is this concept of security champions, which is something I'm very passionate about. Security champions being this idea, let's create a virtual team of people from across the company who they don't report to security, but they've kind of raised their hand, at least to some degree, and said, that security thing sounds kind of interesting to me. Let's build a program around them. Let's give them deeper training. Let's pour into them. Let's coach them so that they become an extension of the security team without being part of the security team. And so I see the most successful organizations out there, the way they're solving the problem that Angela's talking about here is they're taking an approach to security education where they're training everybody across their entire company, but then they're also doing the security champion thing where they might have 2% of the people raised their hand and said, we're kind of interested in this security thing. They spend time really pouring into that 2%, or up to 5%, and then that 5% goes and takes that knowledge and experience to the rest of the industry, the rest of the teams across the company, and then you end up getting this flow of security goodness happening. Everybody's learning about security, but also there are champions or coaches that are sprinkled around the organization that are like, somebody says, "Oh, we're going to do this." They can kind of like be in a daily stand-up and say, raise their hand and say, that's not really a very good idea. That's an insecure way of approaching it. Oh, now that conversation's happening at the stand-up, and we're really changing the security culture of the organization.
And just correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris, but generally speaking, security champions are generally a member of the development team, correct?
Most of them are. I encourage teams and organizations to, first of all, take anybody who raises their hand. So, but you can also have kind of special interest groups within your security champions. Like, imagine a big company where you have all the product managers get together once a month and get a briefing on security and why they need to push it in their products. Imagine how you don't have to fight with as security people with product anymore, because they're like, oh yeah, we understand this. We understand why we have to do this. And so it is primarily development, but there is a lot of advantages to including product management. Even executives can get a different style of information flow or briefing coming out of the Champions program.
Yeah. So I'm going to address a comment that, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this name, Nebosha. In my experience, you cannot shift to the left what you don't see on the right, which is why you see shift everywhere. So shift left requires a strong and growing right. And I am going to have you expand on this, Dean, because I believe that you share this philosophy. You're on mute, Dean. We can't hear you.
Sorry. It aligns very well with, I would say, the Oxeye strategy, where we believe that, as I said earlier, there is a place where you collect the data, and there are the ones who consume the data. And I think that when it comes to vulnerabilities, the one who consume the data are, with no doubt, the developers and the security champions. But you need to understand from where you collect the data. And I think this is where security paradigm are shifting towards collecting data not just earlier in the process, but also later in the process, so it can add context. And that's exactly, you need to see the right. You need to see the runtime environment. You need to get the context. And I think that what makes it easier, by the way, although conceptually it's a bit harder to catch, the difference between runtime to dev is this, because you have CI/CD. So you deploy code, and almost momentarily it goes into production. So from a time perspective, there's no that much difference between runtime environments and dev. But conceptually, when you say, yeah, I'm collecting the data from the runtime, everyone say, whoa, runtime is way after dev. No, it's not. In modern organization where the pace is faster, dev, test, deploy, dev, test, deploy. It's very fast. So our thesis, or our vision is that you need to collect it. You can collect the data from the runtime and deliver it to developers during their dev time. And I think that's the answer. You need to see the right. You cannot ignore the right, because being blind to the right eventually blocks you from fetching data that is very important for the analysis and for making things more accurate and more easy to resolve.
Great. We have a final question here. I'm not sure if it's Ange or Angie, but this is a very open-ended question, so I'm not sure that we're going to be able to answer this comprehensively in this forum or in the remaining time. But how can I secure my design? And Chris, just top-level bullet points. Have at it.
I'm only going to point to one thing based on there's a lot of different directions we could go with that question, but I'm going to come back around to this idea of threat modeling. I've already mentioned once, and hopefully folks have heard of this before. And ultimately, for me, securing the design starts very early in the process when we're talking about a design. And really, threat modeling, what does threat modeling do? It lets us or helps us to see what are the different issues, problems that we could have to wrestle with before we deploy this thing to production, before we even start writing code. And so when I think about how to secure the design, I think you have to go to threat modeling. You have to analyze what you're building, determine what are the ways that attackers or anybody could try to break it, mitigate those things, and then go ahead and build it. And I think if I always say, like, if I can only recommend one thing to an organization, threat modeling is what it is. That's the thing I think that you can start with, you can measure, you can easily see the value proposition it provides, even over a few short months.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the time we have today. We don't have any more questions in the comments section. I would like to extend our gratitude here at Oxeye to Chris for making the time to do this. It's not just this time that we had to do some setup time as well. I encourage everyone to follow us on LinkedIn. And a final plug for Chris, he will be doing the AppSec State of the Union address at RSA conference next week. So if you are there, please make a point to come and check out his presentation. Oxeye will also be at RSA next week. We will be in the early stage expo in booth 13. You can find more information and set up a meeting with Dean or Ron, our CTO, to talk more about application security as it pertains to modern distributed applications, or if you just like to talk, I don't know, anything AppSec. So I want to thank everyone again for your time. We know that this is very valuable to you. Your time is very valuable to you, so we appreciate it very much. And we hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Thank you very much, Chris. Bye-bye.
Yep, thanks. Thank you.